SOUHAN-UNFILTEred at SOUHAN-UNFILTEred.com. This is Jim Souhan, your host. We're at O'Gara's tonight on a Friday night. We have the podcast with Kevin Siefert of ESPN.com, an old friend of mine from the newspaper and media circles. And after the podcast, my buddy Carlos Gonzalez and I will play an acoustic set in the back room. And then it will be time for live karaoke, live band karaoke in the shanty, which is actually kind of fun. We got up on stage last week. The band's really good, and singing with a band is a lot more fun than singing with a machine. So I do recommend Friday nights at O'Gara's. You can find all the podcasts at SOUHAN-UNFILTERED.com. This one and others, including Paul Molitor, Michael Russo, Mike Grant. Mike Grant told some great stories about Bud. But tonight it is Kevin Siefert, and Kevin is speaking from his home in Minneapolis. Let's get to the most important thing first, Kevin. Your wife, Bee Chang of Care 11, was in Ferguson all week. What was that like for her, and what was that like for you?
Well, Gannett, owns Care 11 and owns a station in St. Louis, and so they for about a month or so they've been sort of formulating plans for what they would do whenever there was news about the grand jury, and so she does the social media side of things, and there was heavy interest in bringing in people from all over the Gannett family to come fortify and help the coverage down there. And she was approached and asked if she'd go down there, and we talked about it, and we assumed that Gannett wanted people to be down there to work and not be either in jail or be running for their lives. So we decided that it would probably be a pretty safe situation. She ended up spending almost a week down there, almost all of it working in the newsroom of the station down there. I think she had one day where she took a tour of Ferguson with the mayor of Ferguson, so I think we thought she should be pretty safe. If you were the mayor, you should be pretty safe, I would imagine. And there was the one thing she said that was interesting is that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of private security people who were brought in by various companies and media outlets and other people that would be involved in coverage or in any way be potentially in harm's way. And those security firms were people have been brought in from all over the country to and given temporary work contracts to essentially provide security. So there was security with them when they went to their cars in the parking lot. There was security when they went across the street to get lunch and all that kind of stuff. So if anything, and I'm sure those security companies did very well financially, capitalizing and monetizing on the decision and the riots, but fortunately she never was in any danger. There was never a time where she was put in an uncomfortable spot, let alone a dangerous spot, and she was able to help get the story out, which in the end is the job, as you know.
Real journalism. You got to admire real journalists, and like
no toy department involved there.
No, exactly. But in way of further introduction, Kevin covered baseball in the D.C. area, covered the Orioles, covered Cal Ripken during some of his glory days. Actually came to the Star-Tribune to help replace me on the beat, which, easiest gig you've ever had is replacing me on the beat, the Vikings beat.
Yeah, it wasn't hard to follow, no.
No, and then you segued to ESPN.com, and I know what you do, but I would like you to provide the exact job description, because you kind of dabble in a lot of different things now at ESPN.com.
Yeah, I wish it was easily explained in our world of Twitter and 140 characters. I went to ESPN.com to be the NFC North blogger, and so essentially I covered and mostly did analysis of what the four teams in the NFC North were up to. It's hard enough to cover one team, so with four teams there wasn't an expectation that I was going to be doing daily news or anything like that, and so I just kind of developed the blog as a sort of a landing spot for all the people who wanted to talk trash. Packers fans wanted to talk trash about the Vikings, or Vikings fans who wanted to know what the Bears were up to, or Lions fans wondering when and if they would ever be competitive with the rest of them. So it became kind of a cool community, and we did that for about 5 years before it was, the divisional blogs were so successful, ESPN eventually hired somebody to cover each team. So we now have beat writers for all 32 teams, and there was no need to continue to have a divisional blog. It would be a little redundant. So my job now is sort of, in newspaper parlance, is essentially to be a GA, which is a general assignment NFL reporter. And so it's not really a columnist. I'm not providing straight opinion, but it's not a straight reporting position either. I'm not going out and trying to necessarily break news or find out information. I'm trying to provide analysis and insight and interesting stories from the NFL that either A, aren't being told by our 32 beat writers and 3 or 4 columnists, or all the other hundreds of people who are covering the NFL. So a lot of it's classified under this Inside Slant title, where I'm just trying to get into the background of all the things that happen, especially things like officiating. And we can get into this further, but I think it's an enormously untapped part of the NFL that has intense interest, but not a lot of understanding or information about how it works. I do a lot of things on officiating, and I do a fair amount of work on data and analytics. That's another area that's just starting to come about into football after it's been in a lot of other sports, and use all the numbers that we have from our ESPN Stats and Info group to analyze quarterbacks and sort of try to get behind the jargon that you hear on broadcasts and read maybe in some coverage, and allow the actual data and facts to explain how a quarterback is playing. And so those are some of the types of things. And a lot of it, Jim, as a baseball writer, these are things that have been going on for generations in baseball, and it's taken a little bit more of a hard turn here with sabermetrics, but statistics and numbers and umpire trends, I think, are something that people have been looking at baseball in a long time, and I think finally it's translating to football for a little bit at least.
Yeah, and I want to get into Goodell, and I want to get into officiating and some timely things later in this podcast. Let's start off with the most fun, though. Let's talk about maybe the greatest story ever broken on the Vikings beat, and I think the moment the Minnesota Vikings went from being occasionally scandalous, kind of getting in trouble here and there, to being ridiculous, just consistently absolutely ridiculous. And that was, you broke the Whizzinator story, my favorite newspaper story of all time when you were at the Star Tribune. Go back, and that was Ontario Smith, who was a promising young running back, a little troubled, trying to sneak a Whizzinator, which is a device that theoretically would enable you to offer fake urine to pass a drug test through an airport. Take me back to that story, how you broke it, and whether you agree with me, but that was kind of a jump the shark or tipping point for franchise history. Well,
the second part of your question, I would say that it's one of two instances, and the Love Boat being the other, and we'll get to that in a minute. But basically, I wish I could claim that I had sleuthed that out over a manner of weeks and months. And
you staked out the Whizzinator factory. That's what happened.
And there was a day, and Jim, we're not often in the office as reporters because we're out in the field or we're out at the Vikings facility. But there was a day that I happened to be in the office at the Star Tribune, and in the springtime, in March maybe, springtime in most states, not Minnesota. That's winter, I guess. But I was in the office, and the office phone that I hardly ever use and never gave out because I didn't check the voicemail and didn't use it much anyway, had a voicemail on it, and there was a tip from a source that I knew, but obviously not well enough for that person to have any of my actual contact information, who said, there was apparently an incident at the airport with Ontario Smith, something about a tube of something, and tried to get something through in security, and it'd be in your interest to go check it out. And so, it really was that simple. And in people who might be familiar with basic police reporting, and that's really all I knew as a football writer was basic police reporting, and that you need to find a police report to be able to go with to try to confirm any tip. And so, as it turns out, the airport has its own police department. It's not the Bloomington police. It's not the Richfield police or Minneapolis. Or there's a MSP airport police that handles all the stuff that happens there that of legal matter. And so I called them and found the public information officer, who also happens to be I think the PR guy for the entire airport, Pat Hogan at the time, and gave him the information that I had received and wanted to know if there was a police report for this person, and he took down the information. He said he'd get back to me, and I figured that would be the last I ever heard of it. And a few hours later, I got a call back, and he said, we do have a police report here, and it's available to the media. I said, oh, great, could you fax it over? And he goes, well, that's our policy to not fax these things. You need to come to our office, and we close in 45 minutes. And so now, I'm curious enough that I don't want it to sit there for another day. This was pre-Twitter, pre-Facebook, pre-really breaking news on the Internet at all. But you never know who else might have gotten a tip. And so Ken Youngblood, who covered the Vikings with me as well at the time, I believe, and we got in the car and we drove at I think it was 3:15, and they were closing at 4 from downtown to the airport, and then we realized that the airport police office is behind security, and this was post 9/11, and you can't just go through security without a plane ticket. So we briefly thought about buying a refundable ticket just to get through. We wondered whether that would lead us into more security, and so we called the police department from the outside, and they said you go here, and they give you a pass and you go through. So eventually we got through, and now it's 3:53 or something, and we're getting to the place where the cashier would, because you have to pay for police reports, where you pay the cashier and they print it out for you, and she's just starting to lower the shades of the little opening where you would stand to give her the money, and we got her to stop, and she printed it out for us, and we stood there and we read the police report, and my knees started knocking just as I read it, because the entire story was just laid out right there in the police report. He was, something went off in security. He had vials of powder, and we thought it was believed to be opiates, and had a kit that had a title to the original Wizinator, and this was all in the police report. It wasn't like I had to go ask a bunch of questions. It was all in there, and they we called the office and said we think we have a good story. We're not totally sure what this is. And I think I was driving, and Kent was driving, and I was reading the police report over to our editor, and he was like, "What's an original Wizinator?" And I'm like, "It's the first time I've ever heard of it, but I have a feeling we're going to hear a lot more about it in coming days." And so when I got in the office, again, every desk in the entire newsroom had the Wizinator.com website up, trying to learn what this thing was, and we had an official police report as a primary source. We had we could use it as to write a news story, and so we called the NFL for comment, and Greg Aiello, who is the spokesman, said this, I have to say it's the first time I've ever been asked that question. And we said, well, we're happy to have brought an experienced PR man new information, and we called Ontario Smith's agents, and they were not aware of the incident, and then were furious that we were going to write about it, because in the end there was no there was no drugs found on him, and there was no indication that he missed the drug test or failed the drug test. But for someone who had drug problems before, and that's why he got kicked out of Tennessee, and ultimately it's why he fell in the draft. He was much better than a fourth-round talent, and that's where the Vikings ended up drafting him, was because of his drug history. So somebody with a drug history is found with a kit that is used to mask, used to basically beat drug tests. That's a news story, and it also, there was, according to the NFL, there was a question as to whether, just being in possession of one of those things was a violation of their drug policy. So the story was, again, we didn't try to break it on the website. We held it until midnight, and it showed up in the next morning's paper, and that's where everybody found out about it. And by 9 o'clock in the morning, the whole NFL world knew what a Wizinator was, and it was clearly one of the more bizarre stories. And I wish I had a better story about how it was. We reported it out and called 100 people and sleuthed it out, but sometimes things get handed to you, and that was one of them.
My favorite aspect of that whole story is that it's called the original Wizinator. As if a lot of people were trying to copy that thing, especially after the story came out, I imagine. But
it's the original one, because there's always duplicated, but never always imitated, never duplicated, I suppose.
Exactly. And you and I were both baseball writers who ended up covering the NFL. I kind of went back and forth. The NFL, it can be it's like the because between the lack of access and the secrecy and the paranoid mentality of the league and what actually happens, it's like you're walking around under a cloud, and all of a sudden the sun shines through, and you have these great stories that pop open. And this is that. If that story hadn't broken, you would have written probably a feature about the backup left tackle hoping to play next Sunday or something. Instead, it's the original Wisnator, and that happened so often with us and to us when we covered the Vikings on the beat. I mean, the characters, my God. You had Denny Green trying to sue his own ownership. You had Red McCombs. You had Chris Carter. You had Randy Moss yelling nasty names at us every time we walked in the locker room. The stories and the characters on the Vikings beat are gold. They're absolutely gold. What are your favorites? Like, what are your favorite memories from the beat? Other than the Wisnator.
Yeah, other than the Wisnator. Well, I think my most illuminating / often told story about covering the Vikings was actually related to the Love Boat, which, if people don't know, is the incident that occurred when some Vikings players hired a yacht from Allen Almas on Lake Minnetonka to have a party where things got a little bit out of hand. And there were some graphic details reported, and a lawyer who represented some of the employees on the yacht ended up releasing the information and filing, encouraging police to file charges for public indecency and sex and all that sort of thing. And so it had all the ingredients. It had football, which was already above and beyond the most popular sport in the NFL. It had not drugs, but sex and rock and roll, I suppose, and a lot of names were named, and so there was a lot of information circulating about who was on the boat and what they were doing, and some of the testimony was extremely graphic. And I know we're allowed to curse on this podcast, but I'm pretty sure we can't talk about some of the things that were, or we shouldn't talk about some of the things that were in that.
You're not old enough.
Complaints that were issued. But suffice it to say, it attracted every media outlet in the country, and it wasn't just one of those stories. There's a lot of stories over the years where ESPN would come in, and NBC and Fox, and maybe CNN Sports or CNN SI or Sports Illustrated person, but very rarely were there cases where you'd have, and it wasn't Anderson Cooper, but the Anderson Cooper type people going live in front of Winter Park to provide coverage of what was going on with the Vikings. And so that was during the 2005 season, and in 2006, the Winter Olympics, B actually covered that for NBC, and afterwards I flew out to Rome to meet her, because the Olympics were in Torino, and I flew to Rome, and we met in Rome and spent a week in Rome. And when we first got there, we checked into a hotel in downtown Rome, or somewhere in that vicinity at least, and the people who worked behind the desk, they were native Italians. They were not Americans who worked at the Marriott in Rome or anything like that. And so he saw, we pulled up our reservation and saw Minnesota, and he was like, Minnesota. And I'm not even going to try to do an Italian accent, but Minnesota. Were you on the boat? and so here we were, not only 6 months removed from the incident, but halfway across the world in one of the oldest cities in the world with so much culture and so much history and so much going on there, and they'd be more than excused if they weren't aware of the NFL, let alone, or for the game of football, let alone the Vikings, let alone what had been the big story for the Vikings. And it was just a stark reminder of how much the Vikings sort of front the state of Minnesota to the world. Whatever they're up to, it's arguably the most well-known part of the entire state. And here, a perfect example is an Italian seeing the word Minnesota, and the first and only thing that comes to his mind is the Love Boat. Well, so that was a real eye-opening experience in terms of the impact of the sport, of the team, especially in Minnesota, and what people around the world, what information they get and don't get and are interested in and are not interested in. So that was probably the oh my God moment for me covering the Vikings. And there was so many other stories that got buried for other teams that would have been, the story of the year, the story of the the decade or whatever that were just basically Tuesday for us because of the preponderance of huge international / national type stories.
Well, two thoughts on all that. The first is, Tom, that is why we build these billion-dollar stadiums. It's so our state's name can be broadcast a place like Rome and linked with sex on a boat. I mean, that's what makes it all worthwhile. That brings it all back home. The other one was our friend Tom Pelissero, who used to cover the Vikings, now is working for USA Today, was telling me that he dropped by Viking camp kind of midway through this year, and this is the way it is for the Vikings. Tom went up to like one of the PR guys, and they were BSing, and the PR guy goes, it's been a pretty quiet camp except for the guy getting shot.
Yeah.
and that's the Vikings. I mean, Linval Joseph, like their big free agent signing, gets shot in a bar, and it's the Vikings, so that's no big deal.
Yeah, I mean, and it really didn't. I mean, it had, and this was a city where and the people had already forgotten there'd been a Gophers player, a decade or so before who'd been shot in a bar downtown and killed, and obviously that becomes a bigger story, and you would think in town, because that would bring up the same memories of athletes going downtown and unfortunately being shot, but it was like a 2-day story, and there were no charges filed regarding him, his shot at least, and he was back for the first week, and we just called that Saturday night.
Absolutely. I covered a lot of characters before you got to town. We covered some characters together, and you covered some characters after I got off the beat. I want to ask kind of a two-part question. First question is, did you have anybody you covered on the beat who you really didn't get along with, but later, after you had some separation, you kind of got along with well? And the reason I ask that is, like, I bumped heads with Bernsey like every day of every year on the beat. I mean, we just went at it. Chris Dolman hated me his first stint, and we got on great his second stint. Randall McDaniel didn't really like me. John Randall, went through a phase where he didn't like me, and now, I've gotten along very well with him like that. So I wonder if there's anybody you've had kind of an up and down relationship off the beat. And my other question is just very simply, who were the great characters you covered?
Yeah. I don't know that I had too many incidents where people hated me or I hated them, because I'm such a nice guy, and
well, that is true.
And that's just the way it goes, obviously. I mean, the only people who hated me were the people who worked with me, I guess.
That's a good point. Well, we'll get into that later.
We always said. But what I have found is that some otherwise very normal, decent guys get caught up in the football mentality of the world's against us. They hear the jargon so much from coaches and their teammates of the media being against them. The world's against them. The only thing they can do is fight their way out of a corner, and everybody's the bad guy, and I'm going to be a grump. And one guy who seemed to be that way was Steve Hutchinson. From the minute, I mean, he came here under some really heavy circumstances in terms of the poison pill, and none of us knew him that well. We didn't know if it was his idea to do that, or if he just got caught up in an agent trying to make a bigger contract, or the Vikings trying to be sneaky, or if this was his personality, and he really, he didn't want any part of that discussion. He didn't want any part of being a sort of a team spokesman. He didn't suffer fools that well. And he was one of those guys that I wasn't totally sure he knew who I was for the entire 5 or 6 years I was covering the team. And we didn't have any butt heads. We didn't argue. We didn't have a time where he read something and then sought me out and said he didn't like it or something like that. We never, we just didn't have any kind of interaction at all. And I assume that's the way he liked it. After he played in Tennessee for a year and retired. And he was living until this year in Orono or Medina or somewhere out there. And I'd see him around town, and it was just an entirely different person. And I tweet with him now, an entirely different person. I think he's moved out of town to Tennessee, where I don't blame him after going through last winter. But it's almost like he sort of once he re-civilized himself into society post playing career, he became a normal person again, and much more interaction with him post retirement, or at least post Vikings, than I ever had. And he's a pleasant, nice, smart guy, and you never really get that. And there's a lot of examples like that where you just assume that a guy's a grump or not a nice guy or not smart, and so he doesn't want to interact at all and get tricked into something or something like that. And I think in reality, a lot of these guys you find later that they just were so caught up in the mentality of whatever they're being sold, message-wise, that they act in a much different way than is normal to their personality. And I'm forgetting what your second question was, because I rambled so long.
Oh, just did you have any great did you find anybody to be just a great character? Because I covered Burnsy, and even when I didn't get along with him, I loved him as a character.
Yeah, the obvious is Randy Moss. He wasn't very nice to us,
but he was interesting.
He gave you, when he did talk, he is a guaranteed story. And there was never an interview with Randy Moss that didn't give you something really unique and original to write about. And a lot of these memories started coming back when he had the 30 for 30 Rand University came out a month or so ago, and I was trying to explain Randy to people on Twitter or just in conversations, some of the people that work with him at Fox now, and how just truly unique and original he was. And I think that two things I think about him. One, I was really struck in 30 for 30 where he said there was a lot of the frustration he's had, and he was talking mostly about high school, the incidents he had in high school, but I think it probably pertains to his entire career. Most of the trouble he's got into, most of the frustration he's had is when he's been trying to say how he feels, and people don't pay attention. People don't listen, is the way he put it. And I always thought that people were listening and they were paying attention. They just didn't know what he meant. I think he's one of those guys that his thoughts and the words that come out of his mouth are very rarely connect.
Yeah.
There's just always, he never says what he really means. And the Play When I Want to Play thing was a perfect example. He had been asked, who fires you up? What makes you tick? What's your motivation? And he said, and basically his answer was, no one fires me up. There's no motivation. I motivate myself. I play when I want to play. And he didn't. Most of us don't think he meant that. That he was basically admitting that he only plays some of the time, and when he decides not to play, he doesn't. Even though there was evidence of that on the field, he wasn't admitting that. He was in his own garbled kind of way saying that he's the only one who motivates himself. He's a self-motivator. But he was also so stubborn that he could never he would never admit or correct or clarify what he meant. People were trying to tell him at that time, say what you really meant. Explain what you were trying to say, what the question was, so that people don't think you're admitting to being lazy and admitting to being a guy who half-asses it and that sort of thing. And he never would because he was so stubborn. But the funniest story I ever heard from Randy himself was when I was doing a story actually on Mike Tice and his relationship with players and how he motivates them and how he was sort of in the early years really in line with their thinking, and they had a lot of uproarious meetings, and everybody would be laughing and getting on each. Somehow, and I think it was from John Tice, his brother, who was the tight ends coach. Randy found out that when Mike Tice was young in grade school, he had gotten into a fight and just gotten his rear end kicked, just gotten his ass kicked, and Tice, Moss really pushed John Tice to find out the details of that, and it turned out it was a guy named Andrew Galata, or Stevie Galata. I think it was Stevie Galata who had done it. And one day when Tice was kind of getting on Randy in a team meeting, Randy fired back, and he explained this whole story. It wasn't like somebody else told me about it. Randy was gleeful in explaining this story. He said, Tice, I know all about you. I know what happened when you were 10 years old. This is a team meeting in front of everybody. I know what happened when you were 10 years old. You mouthed off like you always mouthed off, and someone stood up to you, and his name was Stevie Galata, and he whipped your ass. And if you keep talking like that, I'm going to go call Stevie Galata right now, and he's going to whip your ass again. And this was, everybody, he said it in a way that everybody was laughing, and Tice was amused, and everybody, but it also was it was funny, but also a little bit of edgy Randy coming out and making sure that nobody imposed too much authority on him as well. So he was pretty creative and innovative in finding ways to express himself, entertain people. He could be really funny, and that was funny, but it was also sort of, don't go too far because this thing can go both ways type of thing. So, again, very, very unique, original person. We will never see somebody like that come through the NFL again. The Rand University 30 for 30 really brought that home, and it brought back a flood of memories along those lines.
A couple of things on Moss and Hutchinson. Moss, to give just a really quick snippet of what Randy Moss is like to be around, there's the day he brought his dogs or his dog into the locker room, and I think Youngblood or somebody walked up and said, "What's your dog's name?" And Moss said, "Nunya." "Oh, Nunya what?" "None of your damn business." And that was Randy Moss. Don't get too close to me. I will torch you. And the Hutchinson thing, I had the same experience with Hutchinson. He was a grump, and the thing is, he wasn't just a grump to the media. He was a grump to teammates. They always joked about he had to have his. He was like they were going through all these things where they're trying to get their players to hydrate, and they gave up on Hutchinson. Okay, just give Hutchinson his coffee so we can get through the damn meeting, Just let him drink as much as he wants. Keep Hutchinson happy. Okay, everybody else got to drink water. Hutchinson gets his coffee. But I remember I drove to North Dakota to do a big story on Jimmy Kleinsusser right near the end of his career. And Hutchinson hardly ever did interviews. When he did it, or obligatory, or quick, he found out I was doing a story on Jimmy Kleinsusser, who he was really close with and really admired. And he basically set it up through the PR office that I would go meet him in like that little back room. It'd be just me and him. And I walked in and I said, "Hey, can you just tell me what you know about what do you think about Jimmy Kleinsusser?" I just I asked some simple open-ended question. He talked for half an hour about Jimmy Kleinsusser. And then and at the end of the half an hour, he said, "Do you have any other questions?" I said, "No, I couldn't possibly ask another question. You filled it up." So there was some great stuff there. It's just he didn't want to show it.
Yeah, and for the most part, didn't want to be. Obviously wanted to honor one of his close friends and knew how the media works, but just didn't want to probably be involved in the minute-to-minute minutia. He didn't want to give the state of the team's quotes and didn't want to be bothered with a lot of things. But that's a good example of. It was in a decent person was in there somewhere, and all it took was retirement to bring it out all the way.
Right. That is the voice of Kevin Siefert, ESPN.com, writes the Inside Slant and a lot of other football stuff at the website. Former Star Tribune reporter, also covered the Baltimore Orioles for the Washington Times for a while, longtime friend. This is SOUHAN-UNFILTERED.com. Obviously, you can find it at that website along with other podcasts. Let's before we talk more Vikings and more Minnesota stuff, you covered Cal Ripken on a daily basis. I did a bunch of Ripken stories occasionally, but it's different when you're around him every day. Tell me about Cal Ripken, what he was like, and whether he was true to the public perception of him.
When I started covering the Orioles, it was 1996, and so he had already broken Lou Gehrig's record. He already had the record for the most consecutive games played, and so some of the people in the media in Baltimore and in Washington, because there was no Washington team then, the Washington papers and media all covered the Orioles, were wondering how long is this going to go on and what is this about now, because no one was going to break that record. The Gehrig record stood for so long. Ripken was so unique. It was pretty clear that he could have stopped at 21:32 or 21:31, and nobody would have ever broken it. And so it was starting to become a little bit less of a positive thing, if that makes sense. It was becoming, is he selfish? Does he have so much power over the Orioles manager that nobody could get him out of the lineup even if they wanted to? And so there was starting to be some as you know when you cover players in one place for a long time, it's things eventually can get a little hairy between the same media people and the player for all that time. And so I kind of walked into a little bit of a, not poisonous, but it was not a comfortable situation. And so for the first couple of years covering him, really all I did was ask him questions in group things and say hi to him in the clubhouse. But he wasn't a guy that was just sitting in there taking all comers every day before the game. You had to arrange something to do an actual interview with him, and I didn't even try for a couple of years because it just seemed so poisonous. And then, you're around the beat for a little while, and people know who you are, and one thing led to another, and I started just kind of shooting the breeze with him more often when I would see him in the dugout or in the clubhouse or even in the team hotel, because those days a lot of times we stay in the same hotels, and just kind of developed a little bit more trust with him, and it got to be the point where I could, I don't want to say I was his guy or he was my guy or anything like that, but we had a good understanding that when I had something important that I needed to ask him about, he would arrange to talk to me in a place where it would just be me and not the rest of the media. So that was, that was the last probably 2 years of covering of the 4 years I covered the team. So I left there with a really good impression of him that, like a lot of superstar players, you have to earn his trust, but once you do, he could be very accommodating and be very forthcoming and helpful to us doing our jobs. And those last couple of years were some tough years for him. It was when the streak ended. It was when his dad died. It was when he had his first real injury. He had a bad back thing that eventually he needed season-ending surgery for, and he was very, very upfront and comforting about that whole thing. And so, as I'm talking, one story that comes to mind of Cal, and kind of that help you understand the type of situation that existed when I first got on the beat there. Again, he had already broken the record, and so it wasn't clear what he was continuing to play every single day for, because at his age and his skill level had declined a little bit, and they just hired Davey Johnson as their manager. And Davey's a very strong manager, and a guy had won a World Series and very confident in his abilities, and he didn't, he was a National League guy. He liked to make in-game moves, and he didn't think twice in a game about taking Cal out of the game in the seventh for a pinch runner who happened to be the utility infielder. And we sat in the press box. We're like, oh my God, does he even know what he just did? Because this was his first year, probably his first month or two as a manager, and it made perfect baseball sense. He wasn't very fast. They needed to. I believe he was a tying run on first, and so you needed a fast guy to hopefully go first to third or whatever, how it is. And so, from a baseball standpoint, it made perfect sense. But from an Orioles/Cal standpoint, it was a scandal. And Cal was beyond. His steam was coming out of his head. He just sat in the. Usually, when guys get pinch hit for, they might go in the clubhouse and get change their shirt or something. He sat in the dugout, didn't move, and it turned out to be an extra inning game. So he sat there for 7 innings, and the guy who pinch ran for him got picked off, of course. And so immediately Davey realized, because there was like 11 questions after the game, and the first 10 were about why did you pinch run for Cal Ripken, and he was stunned by it. He couldn't believe the institutional power that Cal had at that time, or appeared to have. And so the next thing that Davey wanted to do is he thought he was going to be able within the first 2 months to end the streak and give him the ability to use Cal sometimes as a DH, or maybe use him at third sometimes, or not have to play him at shortstop every time. And so he went to Cal one day and said, hey, what would you think about occasionally playing third? And this was probably noon before a game. And Cal basically, according to what we heard, Cal was not that interested in it. He's a shortstop. He wanted to play shortstop. And so Davey, figured he was going to need to call in reinforcements. So at the end of our daily meeting as a beat writer with him, he said, okay, so before you guys go, this is just a rainy day story. This is something you could look into a little later, but we broached the idea of moving Cal Ripken to third, and it might be a little note for you or something, but just a rainy day type of thing, no big deal. And we were like, have you this would have been the biggest news in 15 years of Cal Ripken's career, basically, that somebody was going to even just to be able to move him from shortstop to third was a really big deal in the city of Baltimore, and where the Orioles had been constructed and run for so long. And it wasn't even a reflection on Cal as much as it was a reflection on the space and the way that everybody tiptoed around him. I firmly believe that if they hadn't never tiptoed around him, this would never have been an issue. But that was just sort of the structure that Davey inherited. And so we said, have you talked to Cal about that? And he goes, yeah, a little bit, but I was kind of hoping y'all would too. So, of course,
it was classic Davey Johnson.
We sprint into the clubhouse, and Cal was in there because he's not always in there before a game, but I don't think he expected the writers to be in there because we were off talking to Davey, but we had all sprinted in there, and so basically, and we asked him about it, and he gave some answers, and neutral answers. But basically, what Davey had done was submarined him, and used the power of the media and the power of the public opinion, because he knew, now that it was known publicly that the Orioles wanted to move him to third base, Davey knew that Cal would never say no and appear to be a guy who was not willing to go along with what the team wanted, and so he kind of exercised some classic media leverage there that worked, and that's how Cal Ripken got moved to third base. It wasn't a meeting of the minds behind the scenes. It wasn't a long discussion over the course of an off season that finally got decided. It was Davey wanted to do it. Cal didn't immediately accept, and so he submarined him and announced it publicly and put him in a position of having to say, no, I won't do what the team wants to do, which of course he wouldn't do. And so that was, and I think I was 23 at the time, and that was my first real experience into how things work in the big leagues, and I never forgot it.
That's awesome. Did you believe the conspiracy theory, which is that there was a night when the lights go out at the ballpark, and the conspiracy theory becomes, and this is during Cal's streak, conspiracy theory becomes Cal had something preventing him from being at the ballpark or from playing that night, so they yanked the cord on the entire ballpark so his streak would not be interrupted. Did you believe it?
No, because I was at that game, and again, this probably would have been 20 years ago, but at the time, I didn't think twice about it, because before most games, that was a very unusual situation, because leading up to the game, we were in the clubhouse beforehand. And we probably didn't see Cal in the clubhouse beforehand, but that's not unusual because, as I said, he wasn't the type to just be sitting in front of his locker doing interviews for 3 hours. He was a lot of times doing workouts or in the training room or whatever. And so before most games in those days, Cal and B.J. Surhoff, who was either playing third or left field at the time, they would warm up together behind home plate. It was almost like a ritual, and I almost, I can see it in my head, and I don't know if I've projected this or somehow it's been fabricated in my brain to satisfy the conspiracy theories. But it was my recollection that those two guys were on the field behind home plate. It was 7:30. In those days, they had 7:35 first pitches, and it was probably 7:10, and they were warming up behind home plate, throwing the ball to each other. And I could see it in my mind. And what makes that night unusual is that the lights went out. Not all the lights in the Camden Yards went out, but the big lights in the first base side and the center field and left, and those lights went out. And when we finally got an explanation, we said, well, why can't you plug them back in? Why can't you fix the fuse? Why can't somebody hit the circuit breaker? And the explanation was something along the lines of the electrical issue is the result of wires that are encased in cement, and it's not that easy. And that is always, I'm not an electrician and all that, but that's always seemed weird because the very next night the lights worked. And so did they break open a bunch of cement in the stadium and fix the wires and then seal it back up all in 24 hours? Was that not really the right explanation? Did we not understand it right? And so that was, I think, what caused the conspiracy theories, was that there was a little bit of a weird explanation, and the lights had been working fine up until shortly before first pitch, and everything was fine the next night. And so, but every time I'm asked about that, I see it more clearly in my mind. I'm almost positive I saw him that night warming up before the game. So I did not believe there was a conspiracy there. There was all kinds of things that were going on, or at least suggested that might be going on, and would have prevented Cal from coming to the ballpark. But unless my mind and memory are playing tricks, I saw him at the park that night.
So you and I were both baseball and football writers, and we both witnessed America's transition from a place and time where baseball and football were kind of slugging it out to a place and time where football has beaten up baseball so badly that baseball won't even walk in the same room anymore. and I'm always fascinated by this question. I've asked it to like everybody I know involved in either sport. What do you think underlies that transition? I mean, there are a lot of easy answers like, well, football's an easy TV sport and all that kind of stuff. But is there something deeper? Is there something more sociological behind it?
My answer would be easy: fantasy and gambling. That's why football has become so popular. I actually, I think Pelissero, I was on his radio show a while back, and he asked, with all the discontent that seems to exist around the NFL, and not just the Peterson and Ray Rice stories, but just every year there seems to be all these, really energetic opposition to the concussion story. There's all kinds of really deep and hard sort of pushback against the league. And so why is every year the TV ratings going up, and why are for the most part stadiums still selling out, and why are cities still giving billion-dollar stadiums to billionaire owners? And I honestly think that there probably has been a reduction, and I wish I had data for this. I wish this was just totally anecdotal based on hearing from people, but I think there has been a reduction in the number of pure football fans, but who have been turned off by some of the things that have happened off the field or around the field, or just the fact that it's become such a big business. But it's that those figures have just been totally overwhelmed by the fantasy and gambling attraction, and gambling is attracted to the sport because it's so unpredictable. I mean, if there's so, I don't know if parity is no longer the right word. There's just no teams are that good except for one or two each year, or maybe two or three. And so everybody else is, for the most part, stuck in that middle, where everybody is just good enough to have a chance to win, but nobody's, for the most part, good enough to be the favorite. It's a real, true, honest, you can bank on it favorite. So that's a world of fun for gamblers, and the fantasy aspect, it lends itself to fantasy sports much better than in basketball or football or hockey, and that's why so many people who may not even be a fan of any particular team or player, have been drawn to the game purely for competitive reasons to win their fantasy, or in high stakes fantasy to win money. And so I think that's, and again, there will be books written about this. There will be sports history texts that go into it deeper. But I really think that's the short explanation of why football has become so big in the country, why it seems to be impervious to all these off the field / big picture hits. I mean, there's basically, one of the biggest stories surrounding the sport is that the basic act of playing football can cause irreversible brain damage and early death, and that's the bottom line of the whole CTE / concussion / league of denial sort of theme. And it hasn't been totally proven out yet, but we continue to see more anecdotal examples. And despite the fact that appears to be the case, there's been no bottom line hit to the popularity of the sport. And I don't think that's because people don't care about the health and the welfare and the violence. I think those people that have taken a step back, but there's far too many money-making opportunities, far too many opportunities to whet your competitive interest for it to do anything other than to continue to have grown over that period.
Well, it's funny because I played fantasy a little bit in the early 90s, then I didn't play again until like the last couple of years. Basically, I ended up running my fiance's fantasy team for her, or let me rephrase that. Let me get myself in trouble. Helping run her fantasy football team. Yeah. And all of a sudden, I found myself watching Titans-Texans at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night when I had to be up early the next morning because I had a backup wide receiver I needed 8 points from. It really does get into your brain and throw all perspective aside. And, I'm worried about concussions, and there are a lot of things about the NFL I don't like, but I needed 8 points.
Yeah. I really feel that's the case, and that's why the Red Zone channel was one of the most brilliant ideas in the history, probably, of cable TV. And obviously the NFL is the one that has the rights ability to run that. But there's a whole community of people who don't watch games anymore. They watch the Red Zone just to see the scoring opportunities and to basically be able to do their fantasy and we all, even the quote unquote traditional football writers and reporters and even people commentating on TV are all asked to at least acknowledge, by our bosses, the fantasy implications of what we're talking about. A lot of the things, basic reporting of NFL and NFL teams have fantasy implications. When you're writing about injuries, those are fantasy implications. But one of the most popular things that the ESPN group of 32 that cover each team has done this year is a weekly paragraph that is basically advertised to be an insider's fantasy look on each team. And so the idea is this guy spends every day on the team, or this woman spends every day around the team. They know more about the team than anybody. If anyone knows whether this guy's going to play or whether this guy's going to be prominent in a game plan or this guy is going to take a back seat, it's this person. So, let's use that credibility to sell subscriptions to our fantasy thing. And that thing's been as popular as any other thing that's been produced by our NFL reporters. And that just is another anecdotal example of where the interest lies. You could write a 800-word story that breaks down the use of the 4-3 versus the 3-4 in the Packers defense, and it won't get half the traffic that a one-paragraph fantasy insight on their number 3 receiver would get on a website.
5 more minutes with Kevin Siefert of ESPN.com on SOUHAN-UNFILTERED.com. I should be able to get that right by now. I'm going to throw a few things at you. Give me a quick reaction. First of all, my favorite aspect of that Moss I play when I want to play story, my favorite aspect, it was classic Sid. Sid was trying to defend Randy Moss, and he ended up tagging him with the quote that ruined his reputation.
It was amazing. There's been more than a few athletes in town whose close relationship with Sid has ultimately led to their at least partial demise. But that's the poison pill you take in those situations.
Absolutely. All right, broadcast review. Is there a TV show or a movie that you're hooked on right now?
Well, I saw the Star Wars trailer today.
Did you?
And it got me excited, and then I looked up, and it was December 2015. So I have to pace myself because I grew up a big Star Wars person, and I'm enjoying introducing it to my kids. But I don't know if I can wait another 13 months. And I'm expecting to get some kind of insight from my Disney employee status now, and so far no good. But as far as TV, I haven't watched anything since Lost because I got way too emotionally involved in that. It changed my life. Not for the better, and I don't want another TV show to do that.
You're weird. My broadcast review is Lilyhammer. It's a Netflix-only series. Stephen Van Zandt, Springsteen's guitarist, did kind of it's both a mob show, a dark comedy, and a social commentary on different cultures. He ends up in Lillehammer, Norway, on the the FBI's protection program, whatever you call it. They hide him in witness protection program. Thank you. And it's this mob character in Lillehammer. It's brilliant. Favorite song or band that comes to mind?
Well, speaking with you, of course, I'd have to say Springsteen. Right?
Well, no, you're allowed to go another direction here.
I do like Springsteen, but my growing up, my favorite was Weird Al Yankovic, and it's kind of become my a little bit of a caricature of me right now. But I did actually meet him once, and he's my Facebook avatar profile pic, and I really do respect the brilliance with which he writes the songs, and so I'm not ashamed to say that of all the musicians out there, the one I probably pay most attention to is Weird Al.
Once again, you're weird, but we accept it.
Yeah, that's been established. Yeah.
I'm gonna, because I'm playing in a rock band with Carlos Gonzalez. We hope to be out playing out in the next month or two, and he loves Social Distortion. And one thing you really find out when you start listening to a lot of Social Distortion and practicing a lot of Social Distortion is Mike Ness of Social Distortion loves Johnny Cash, and so of course we've segued from Social Distortion into doing Folsom Prison Blues, and the brilliance of the songwriting in the old country songs just absolutely grabs you. All right, answer this question.
If you like Social Distortion, there's another band that I do like, not as much as Weird Al, of course, that is similar in their name. It's the Gaslight Anthem.
They're great, yeah.
Played here couple months ago. They played the Fine Line. I saw them there once, and also at First Avenue. But they're a really good New Jersey rock and roll band.
They're really good, and there's like one. I think Springsteen's most recent live concert video has Brian from Gaslight Anthem getting up on stage with them, which is really cool.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Answer this question. I was wrong about. Remember, only a minute here.
I was wrong that I would leave Minnesota after 2 years of living here.
I thought the same thing.
Yeah. When you recruited me to move here, and I think you probably said, you're not coming here for life. You're just coming here for a job, and maybe it'll be a stepping stone. Who knows? And I knew what the weather was like. I grew up in Virginia in the South, and that's the type of weather I was used to. I didn't know anybody coming here, and I didn't even change my license plate when I moved here. I assumed I would be here for a couple of years, and I'd go on to the next job, and here I am 15 years later. Thanks a lot.
Same thing. I moved here from Dallas, thought I'd be here 2-3 years, I'd leave for another job, and I've been here for almost 25 now. And I'm cold.
Oh, my God.
I'm cold.
It's still cold.
I was wrong to answer the question. I thought the 49ers were building something really sustainable, and it looks like they're falling apart right before our eyes. Answer this one. People are yelling at me on the Internet about...
They're yelling at me because I just tweeted that I had to. There's controversy about the Seahawks making a video with the quote "Bye Felicia," and I used to be the young kid in the office who all the old vets would ask to clarify pop culture references, and so. But I saw that the Seahawks made a "Bye Felicia" video, and I had to Google it myself, and I'm feeling really old now. And I tweeted out that I'm feeling old. I had to look up "Bye Felicia," and everybody's hammering me on Twitter for not knowing that it was a great scene from the movie Friday, and it refers to when Ice Cube, a woman sits next to him that I guess she's interested in him, but he's not, and he treats her poorly and says something like, "Bye, Felicia, get away from me." And so I was supposed to know that. Somehow it worked into a video the Seahawks and Russell Wilson posted after last night's game, and I'm getting hammered for not knowing what the reference was.
I didn't know it either, so I'm going to let you off the hook on that one. Kevin, I appreciate it, man. It's been fun. That is Kevin Siefert. You can find him at Siefert ESPN. Find him at the Inside Slant column on ESPN.com. Again, this is the Alive and Social Network. This podcast is on SOUHAN-UNFILTERED.com. Also on Alive and Social, we have a bunch of other podcasts. Jeff Dubay, Rusty Gatenby. We have music shows. We have pop culture shows. If you are listening live tonight at O'Gara's, Carlos Gonzalez and I are going to play an acoustic set in the back room, and then at 9 o'clock, live band karaoke in the shanty. Upcoming shows, December 3rd, Glenn Perkins with me, 5 o'clock at the local. December 10th, Gary Louris of the Jayhawks, 5 or 6 o'clock at Kieran's. We're still setting up the time on that one. December 17th, 5 o'clock at the local with Roy Smalley, who's a great baseball storyteller. Kevin, I appreciate it, man. I hope we do this again sometime in the future.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jim.
I appreciate it. That's Kevin Siefert. Again, SOUHAN-UNFILTERED.com on the Alive and Social Network. Thank you for listening.